Welcome to the 10th anniversary of the San Antonio Book Festival and this special pre-recorded session. I know the audience is seated outdoors, but for everyone's safety, we kindly encourage everyone to keep their masks on, except when actively eating or drinking. We also ask that you silence your cell phones so that everyone can enjoy the program uninterrupted. If you wish to support the writers participating in this event, copies of our books will be available in the Nowhere Bookshop tent right across the street. I'm Alex Marzano-Lesnevich, and I'm joining you from the Black Mountain Institute, which operates from the city of Las Vegas, the territory of the New Way or the Southern Paiute people. I'm going to begin by introducing you to our fabulous panelists. After I read one of their bios, they will then read to you. So we'll get a chance to hear everyone's words before we plunge into what I trust will be an invigorating and interesting conversation. So we'll begin with Eileen Myles. Eileen Myles is the author of more than 20 books, including For Now, Evolution, Afterglow, a dog memoir, Chelsea Girls, and I Must Be Living Twice, new and selected poems 1974 to 2014. Myles's many honors include 4 Lambda Literary Awards, the Clark Prize for Excellence in Art Writing, the Shelley Memorial Award from the Poetry Society of America, Creative Capital's Literature Award, as well as their Andy Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant, and a Foundation for Contemporary Arts grant. Myles lives in Marfa, Texas, and New York City. Please take it away, Eileen.
Oh, take it away means I'm reading.
You're going to read to us, yes.
Okay, crazy. Okay, this is the one-page discipline was very interesting and traumatic, maybe. I would be holding a baby turning round and round like the end of a Bergman movie I loved. This time the subtitles would thunder their name was Eileen Myles, and I would stand in that kitchen for hundreds of years. The baby's head growing large and small, my dress growing flowered, my feet, my bare feet, sandals on my feet, Birkenstocks, polio shoes, Doc Martens. I would stand there holding my baby in slips, in punk orange rock silk slips. I would wear cutoffs, tight, short ones in my Birkenstocks. I would be holding my baby and singing. He would be fucking some girl at work that looked like me. I looked like a man holding the baby. I had a beard and I was wearing a kilt and a pair of high-top sneakers and tattoos on the calves of my legs. I was singing and humming and smiling at my baby. Behind me, there was a giant window and a tree with red and orange and yellow leaves. It's Harvard College. I'm a faculty wife. I wear a maroon velvet dress. My hair is in braids, and I'm holding my baby. Someone leans a mic towards my mouth. I recite a poem by Christina Rossetti. I am holding my baby and murmuring the poem to her. Well, behind me, the universe is turning. He said, see where the North Star is and see that star way down there, almost at where you imagine the horizon. Well, 15,000 years ago, that star used to be where the North Star is, and I imagined the circle of space turning and turning for thousands of years.
Thank you so much. Could you just tell us where that's from?
Yes, it's an excerpt from a novel in progress I'm working on called All My Loves. And I got to say, the word that jumps out, which is very of my generation, is polio shoes, which is what we called Doc Martens in the 50s. And I keep going back and forth, in, out, but it's very particular to the time. So it just, I don't know. To disabled people, I say, it's in progress. I'm not sure,
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and how exciting that we got to hear something in this early sneak peek. All right, next to Denne Michele Norris is the editor-in-chief of Electric Literature. A 2021 Out 100 honoree, her writing has been supported by MacDowell, Tin House, VCCA, and the Cambilio Foundation for African American Fiction, and appears in McSweeney's, American Short Fiction, and Zora. She co-hosts the fabulous and critically acclaimed podcast, Food for Thought, and is hard at work on her debut novel. Follow her on Twitter and Instagram at the Denne Michele. Den, please read to us.
Hi, okay, I am going to read a page as I was instructed to do. Mm-hmm. Someone will come, an audience gathering will sound in the distance. Lights will dim, then rise from darkness, a single orb resting at the center of the stage. Vivian will enter from stage right, walking quickly, gripping her instrument in her left hand, her gown in the right. She will be determined not to trip in the stilettos she's chosen for her Lincoln Center solo debut. She will feel cast among the highest of angels, the single orb of light, her divine halo. She will walk across the stage with authority. She will bow with a flourish, her smile the epitome of feminine grace. Everett, sitting in a reserved seat in the second row, applauding her entrance, will be thinking the word wife, his ears and tongue exploring anew, listening, enunciating, excavating the newness of something that is not really so new. That's my wife, he will say, almost audibly to the woman next to him, but not quite, because this is not a thing they are telling people, not just yet. To Everett's eyes, Vivian will always be without flaw, whomever she is, whatever form she takes. But for that night, she will wear a champagne gown covered head to toe in crystals. They will shrink in size from the neckline all the way to the hemline until they look more like a shimmering mist than actual gems. Her hands will glimmer, her nails coated in clear polish, and a single gemstone placed delicately in the center of each. Vivian will look out over the audience, waiting for the applause to die down, her eyes skimming everyone, recognizing a few faces. She will smile briefly at Olivia, then Charlotte, then Christopher. She will linger when she meets Everett's eyes. I am his wife, she will think. She will say, almost audibly, but not quite.
Love entering on a mystery. Thank you, Jen. And could you share with us what that's from?
Oh, yeah, it's a scene towards the end of my novel that is almost finished.
Amazing, wonderful. And what's the title?
When the Harvest Comes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Now to Tori Peters, who is the author of the novel Detransition Baby, published by One World, which won the 2021 PEN Hemingway Award for debut fiction. It was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Awards, a finalist for the Brooklyn Public Library Award, and was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. The novel is being adapted by Amazon and the producers of Grey's Anatomy. Take it away, Tori.
I'm going to read from Detransition Baby, and the scene that I'm reading takes place when one of the protagonists, Reese, is at a party. It's one of those like direct marketing parties where they sell essential oils, to each other, and so it's a lot of women gathered for the purposes of buying essential oils from each other. And Reese is the only trans woman there. A youngish woman who speaks in a husky, honeyed voice, though Reese can't tell whether from Chardonnay or habit, is recounting with excitement that her husband will be away at a bachelor party this weekend. The party is somewhere upstate, and the woman works herself up, describing her husband in flannel, drinking whiskey, and tacitly of the anticipation of his returning home, smelling of wood smoke and replenished masculinity, to ravish her. The woman wears an immaculate cream skirt, so crisp it looks freshly starched, even though she claims to have come directly from work. There's an audacity in wearing a cream skirt so crisp. Cream is even less forgiving than white. A single stain on cream and the whole skirt looks vaguely dirty, whereas a single stain on white just looks like a single stain. Reese once read in a fashion magazine that at the turn of the century, the leisure class wore immaculate whites to show that they did no work, the same class fashion that gave the feminine gender heels, corsets, and long nails. Thus, Reese has to surmise that this cream-skirted woman has not actually married a ranch hand, and so most likely, her husband is another New York City white-collar worker. How is it, Reese wonders, that a bunch of New York men wearing flannel and slamming whiskey in a cabin is seen as a sorely needed release of their barely tamed and authentic manliness, but when she, a trans, delights in dolling up, she's trying too hard. It's not that Reese thinks that her desire to dress up reflects some authentic self. It's just that, unlike bros, she's willing to call dress up time what it is. Meanwhile, this starched woman has practically soaked her panties over the homoerotic escapades of her man upstate. Can you imagine if Reese confided in these same women with the same apparent horniness about her Truvada birth control regimen? Social disaster. She decides for the 10,000th time that heterosexual cis people, while willfully ignoring it, have staked their whole sexuality on a bet that each other's genders are real. If only cis heterosexuals would realize that, like trans women, the activity in which they are indulging is a big self-pleasuring lie that has little to do with their actual personhood, they'd be free to indulge in a whole new flexible suite of hot ways to lie to each other.
Thank you, Tori.
Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that with us. And I am going to be bringing up the end of this wonderful array of folks each time. So I am, as I mentioned, Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. I'm the author of The Fact of a Body, A Murder in a Memoir, which received a Lambda Literary Award, the Chautauqua Prize, the Prix de Librairie de Quebec, my French is still terrible, the Grand Prix de Lettres L, and the Prix France Inter-JDT. It was translated into 11 languages and is currently in development with HBO. My second book, Both and Neither, which I'll read to you from in a second, was excerpted in the Best American Essays 2020, will be also in 2022, and is forthcoming from Doubleday and publishers internationally. So I'm going to read to you from the current, very much work in progress draft of Both and Neither, close to the beginning of the book. In 1906, a restaurant owner in Missouri goes to the police with suspicions about one of his employees, John Whitman, who has recently married a girl who also works at the restaurant. John seems to have little idea how to take care of his wife. He has no place to house her. He has not saved money to feed or to clothe her. It is almost as though it has not occurred to him that he will need to, that he has not been raised to know this role. Likely the owner's suspicions are about poverty and poverty or class. Likely he never suspects what John will instead confess. But to the police, John says, "My real name is Pauline Webster. I married this girl as a matter of accommodation. She said she couldn't live without me." And what of Etta, his wife? She swears she didn't know, but she refers to him sometimes as he, sometimes as she, even after the story is public. When the news hits papers from Spokane to Shanghai, it appears with a sidebar that could well be an instruction manual. What Pauline did to appear like a man. Practiced walking with long steps. And I think of myself pacing that long ago New Orleans apartment, holding my hips and my shoulders square. Enunciated slowly to avoid talking in high tones. The phrases I would repeat back to the vocal coach. Kept her hair clipped close. In writing this, I feel myself reach for the back of my own head, where 2 days ago, the barber's clippers shaved the curls that had begun to spring up there. This is a book about struggling to live as who you are when there is no narrative for that person, no role to suit, no story for your story, and discovering all along that there was such a narrative, just one you never knew. This is a book about history that was left out of history, or at least any of the history I learned, and maybe that you did too. This is a book about needing to look outside yourself to understand who you are, and to find the courage to see beyond the possibilities that have always presented themselves to you. It begins with a kind of exodus, not just from a place, but from a life. Okay, so I would love to begin with a question about sort of identity, language, and observation, which is a theme that has come up in all of our readings today. I'm going to start by directing the question to one of you for all of these, and then hopefully everyone else will join in. So please, while the first person is answering, if you could just have in mind what you two would like to add to the conversation. And by all means, I would love to get a robust sort of interchange going. So if you've got questions for each other, please do just feel free to insert them, bring them. Let's get this going as conversation. But yeah, as I mentioned, one of the themes, and Tori, I'm going to start with this for you. One of the themes, yeah, just letting you know now. One of the themes that has come up, as I said, in all of our readings is this idea of observation and language and those things playing into identity. And, we are 2 years now into this global pandemic that has changed, frankly, how much and how we are observed. And I am wondering how that has shown up in your writing, or how it's shown up in how you're thinking about this question of gender identity, language, and the element of observation being tied into that.
Good question.
Well, is this this one's for me still?
This one's for you. Yeah. Yes,
Okay.
thank you for starting us off.
Thank you for the honor. I mean, for me, I think one of the reasons that I chose to read that scene is that it's actually about cis people's gender. It's about cis heterosexual people's gender. And I think that something that's happened over the last couple of years is that cis people have figured out that they have genders too, and that that's actually what a lot of the sort of angst of this moment is that I think historically there have been minorities, and that eventually the minorities have developed lenses that then a dominant culture picks up, oftentimes with a lot of angst. So, it was like you had you had people, queers develop a kind of queer lens, and suddenly straight people realized, like, oh my God, we have a sexuality too. You had, Black scholars and scholars of color develop certain lenses, and suddenly white people were like, oh, look, we're actually white, in not an unmarked kind of category. And that we're in a moment, I think, where the lenses that trans people and gender variant people of all sorts have developed are being picked up by a dominant culture, and they're looking at themselves and they're realizing they have gender, and there's a reaction to it. And for me, part of what's interesting is not just looking at trans people or gender variant people in how they're reacting in this moment, but also looking at the genders that I see all around me of all sorts of people, and the ways that they're acting them out and developing them. So that's been the thing that I've been watching so much during the last couple of years.
How do you think that tension around cis people are really clinging to the idea that gender is something real, it's just something just solid, real, known, unchangeable, et cetera? Where do you think that comes from?
And historically, I think it comes from the fact that people find security in naturalizing narratives. Like if it's like, it's hard to know how to live sometimes, and if you can just say, like, this is what I am, and I never have to think about it again, and this is the natural way to do things. I mean, this idea of what is natural, it feels very safe, it feels very secure. And I think that we've had, although people of all sorts of genders, you can find them throughout history, I think that one of the things that's being challenged now is the idea of what is normal or what is natural, or what these kinds of questions. And I think so as a result, people are both holding to them tight in the face of being challenged, and there's a kind of insecurity that comes from for all of us, in having to basically be like, oh my God, there's like a whole bunch of new work that I might have to do to figure myself out,
Thank you so much. Eileen and Dan, would either of you like to join into this?
Yeah, I would like to. Yeah, it's a great question. I think thinking about the pandemic in relationship to trans issues is so interesting, because I think that gender is always a performance, and it certainly is in terms of those of us who travel and move through the world, and you're just apprehended in a multiple of ways. It always was, for as long as I can remember, going to the airport was the most trans moment, and the only way that I was ever kind of passing in a comfortable way was when I had very short hair and I was carrying a camouflage duffel bag, and I was coming out of San Diego, and my gender was military, and nobody cared what I was. It was so interesting. I was like, wow, this really travels, But what I read from is this, the section of the novel is very much about, it goes from rape to war to birth to this kind of explosion of maternity, kind of. And I was in a relationship during the pandemic with somebody who was very much wanting to have a child, and it's never, and I've, it's very generational that that was never, when I first, came out in the 70s, it was just like it meant you didn't do that, and as time passed, and it just like the understanding of gender and what's possible, technically has changed. Being queer, being LGBT meant having children and, families and stuff. And so it's kind of like being a parent has been this bullet I've kept, kind of almost getting hit by and then dodging, but never was it happening to my body. And so the piece that I read from was about entering the I guess the gender of being the person who has letting maternity be my gender, in a way, which was so, I realized it was so surreal that it felt really rich. And I wrote that during the pandemic, and then it was sort of sleeping for a while, and when I kind of pulled it out, I was like, wow, that's just kind of, disarming and exciting in this way, you know. And also, I mean, the other thing I have to say about the pandemic has been that, you know, I got very involved with the environment in New York and East River Park, and the legal. That I think there's just a dimension to that that is so interesting, because the legal dimension of personhood and who has rights, and you know, we've gone so past corporations having rights, and now we're looking at whether lakes have rights, and it seems to me that these are gender issues. You know, it's like the personhood of what, you know, and you know, and what that means in terms of rights, and it's pretty exciting to me to challenge that in a completely radical way and be far past conventional ideas of gender.
I love that idea. Eileen, how are you defining gender as a word?
I mean, I think probably container is the, you know, and kind of maybe even fleeting in a way, you know.
I'm going to return to that.
But I only just say that one has to persistently find a way to be comfortable, and so then that's definitely gender.
Thank you. Dan.
I just really quickly addressing what Eileen just said. I think that's really interesting and apt, because when I think about how I define and think about gender as a concept, I think about the word dynamic. And when I think about that, I mean, I think about it in terms of the sort of musical meaning of it as an always in motion, always changing. And that kind of is related to fleeting. And I think, I don't know, maybe we're sort of seeing eye to eye there. But for me, when I think about the pandemic and I think about transness, it's very straightforward for me in a way, in that publicly, at least, when the pandemic started, I was identifying as really non-binary, but like male / non-binary. And it was the pandemic, it was the shutting down of everything. It was the sort of cessation of movement that really, like, I was alone in my little bedroom in my apartment in Brooklyn with 2 roommates who I wasn't close to. I had no friends in my neighborhood at that time in Williamsburg. I felt very, very alone. You know, I had a lover. We stopped seeing each other because, you know, you didn't know what you could do. I was super, super alone. And for me, it was like, I realized within maybe 2 months, I was like, I cannot run from this thing that had been a question in my head since I was 18. I was like, I can't run from this anymore. So we have to deal with it. And I have to think through that. And in a way, that timing worked out well, because I felt like I had a lot of privacy, which was really important for me to like think through things and to like find a great therapist and to just like ask myself questions that I hadn't really dared to ask myself in the past. But what I think is so interesting about all of that, and this sort of relates to what Tori read, and I think to an extent to what I read as well, is that those are moments in which presentation is really happening. And in the page that Tori read, in this case, it's a trans character sort of observing how cis people are presenting themselves sort of before they've realized that they have a gender, it seems. And in what I was reading, this is a character, a trans character who's literally on stage after having, you know, sort of come out as trans to her husband, but not anyone else, but is literally on stage and is thinking about, and they're sort of receiving each other and presenting to each other. And I haven't worked all of this out, but I feel like, you know, Eileen said earlier, gender is performance, which I think is really, really, really apt and really important. But I think I'm just thinking through that still, this idea about how much performance and how much, you know, knowing that you're being perceived and being received by people, how much that influences gender. I think about that in terms of myself when I think about medical transition and what all that means and what I want to do, and you know, being cis passing versus not being cis passing and all of those kinds of questions. So I think for me, one of the great things about the pandemic is just that the pause in sort of public life for people who are like not public has really sort of opened up and exploded how we can think about our genders, how we can perform our genders, or if we need to perform our genders, or not even, when we think about what we are and how we identify on the inside. And these are all questions that, again, I don't have answers to, but that I'm just sort of constantly thinking about.
A lot of that done. And I relate to it so hard. I mean, I'll say one of the interviews that I did during the pandemic that I think about all the time was with a psychologist who works with a lot of trans children. And the children she was working with, all their grades went up in the pandemic if they had a supportive home environment, because suddenly they weren't afraid of where they were being perceived from. They weren't afraid of the mockery. They could control how they were perceived in the space of the screen. And so had this space for what was being presented on screen and what was kept outside of screen. And I think I was so desperate for like a positive story at the point where I did that interview that I found myself really responding to it, even though we know, of course, it was also just it has been a terribly difficult time for many people with isolation, including many children, and depending on what home environment is like. I expected that my gender would feel more shored up during the time at home because everyone in my pod was trans. It's like, this is great. I'm just only going to see trans people in person now. And so therefore I will just feel completely more comfortable. And instead I had the experience where I felt like things became ether, where I wasn't, without that kind of contrast, without that definition against, I was no longer quite as shored up, which is something I'm still thinking about, how much of gender is relational and how you find yourself, what do you find yourself being certain of and being secure in no matter where you are and how you're read, but then also how much you need that reading to sort of brush against and find commonality and find difference. Just something I don't have answers yet, but something I keep thinking about. Which leads me maybe to the question of language and how we use language to identify ourselves. Eileen, in your work over so many years, figures named Eileen keep showing up, right? And I love that in the excerpt you read, we get a figure named Eileen, but then we get a ton of also different images and in a way, different aspects of identity. And it makes me think a lot about things that Jules Peterson has written really beautifully about the drive for the insistence on consistent language and consistent identity being a cis drive, a cis desire. Whereas it might be more natural to embrace all these different multiplicities of language, all these different multiplicities of identity. How do you think about it for yourself, and particularly when it comes to putting identity in language in your work? This figure named Eileen who has lots of different words associated with them.
But you began the question actually about my name and how I use my name in my work.
Yes, which is, yeah. I suppose I'm including your name in that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's been almost a joke for me that, I mean, the name is so strange because the name is received. It's sort of like you're like this poem that your parents invented. It's like, why did they give you that name? And how do you get out from underneath it? And then how do you reclaim it and stuff? And for some reason, I mean, I've never, I've always been comfortable with my name. I like the sound of my name, so it's a good thing. And I think that when it seemed funny from day one, like thinking about fiction and nonfiction and what's the difference, and how is Eileen not a fiction? It's just like, just the fact that I didn't write this, that they wrote this, and just the fact that so many of the conditions that created identity and places that you grew up and developed were givens, and that we make choices, but we're just so formed by the things that were actually, like imposed on us, and it seems to me that so much of the journey in my writing has been this search from the interior and out and back again, and that and like in the same way that I might say that, that gender is a container, Eileen is a container for something that otherwise I don't find to be very fixed, and so even, I think probably at whatever time it was a big question whether you were butch or femme, I think that I remember just feeling very comfortable in saying that I was the gender of Eileen, and in retrospect, it seemed like a relatively trans way to describe oneself, that it's just like, it just was kind of a brand that I occupied within and behind, and it's funny because in terms of pronouns, they've just changed. I mean, I've been writing for, 40 years. And so the pronouns have shifted, constantly. And it's always been a question, when work gets reprinted from an earlier time. It's like, if I don't use that pronoun now, do I stand behind it? What do I do about translation? What do I do about, and so again, it seems like the very appearance of my own name seems to be the solitary fact that holds that all. And it seems like a good thing and a ludicrous thing too, in the best sense of the world, that there's just a play and having a name.
Say more about the ludicrous thing.
Well, because it isn't, it's just like it's fanciful. I mean, like, what was going on when you were named this thing? What did they have in mind? And you don't have to bear that. You bear the reinterpretation. So it just seems like a name is a constant site of play, you know. And so I've just always, enjoyed that, and just even, it's so funny. I was just like, and I was thinking about when we were talking about the pandemic. I mean, I have some friends in Marfa, but I was pretty alone. And I spent a lot of time with dogs and horses, and very close I don't ride horses so much, but my dog is obsessed with horses. We visit horses, and a young horse was born, and they called the horse Piss and Vinegar, but I called this horse Tween. It's just like Tween seemed like this horse's name. It just didn't even strike me for the longest time that was a gendered term. And then like yesterday or something, I saw someplace in print that somebody said, "Oh, my gender was Tween." And I thought, that's my gender, and I realized and it rhymes with Eileen, and just like, again, there's just more play in there, anyway, I'll leave it there.
That's fantastic. I'm going to be thinking about that line, a poem, that your name is a poem that your parents invented. I think I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. Den and Tori, I'm curious about this for both of you, but I'm also curious about it with your characters, whether this resonates at all with how you think about giving your characters names, because in some ways, I guess in that moment, they are, a poem that you've invented in that name.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. Oh, do you want to, you can go, Tori.
No, go ahead, please.
I was gonna say, there's so much I can say about like naming and things, but it's really, really interesting because for me, when I thinking about this character first, for example, for most of my novel, this character's name is Davis. And that was a name that came to me very quickly and very easily, very early on. And it's one name that never changed throughout all the writing of this book. And I really enjoy the process of finding names and thinking through names and figuring them out, because it's this process that for me feels sort of magical. And that has very little rhyme or reason, other than I have to hear it, I have to think it, I have to say it, I have to type it, I have to want to type it a lot. And so when I was renaming this character, what was interesting to me is that I stumbled on this name completely sort of randomly. I have a very close friend whose daughter is named Vivian, and with the French spelling that ends in E-N-N-E. And I was literally looking names up because I was like, I don't have time. Like, I need to figure this out quickly because I'm like trying to be on the move. And I saw the name and it just worked, and I fell in love with it. And I actually had to text my friend, and I was like, how do you feel about this? Like, how would you feel about this? My friend's a writer, like, she understands, she loved it. But it was, to me, that's where the play is. I love what Eileen said about the whole poetry aspect of it, because that's where the play is. And then when it comes to like there's a whole crazy story about how I got my birth name. And for a long time, I thought I would have a different name when I was transitioning. And then I sort of came up with this name. It just popped into my head one day, and I said, that's it. And I knew it immediately, and that was it. But I had spent a long time going by a different name, which Tori remembers briefly, because we were in writing group together, and I was going by this other name for a while, and that for most of that group. But I don't know, it's playful, it's fun, it's joyous for me. And I feel like that's some of the, that's one of the very joyful things in transness, because it's one of the things that sort of shows the world and presents and manifests the way in which we get to take complete ownership of who we are, and of this aspect of ourselves that like we've grown up probably not feeling that we have ownership of, right? It's like that's like a big idea, and our names, that's like a small distillation of that. It's like this focused point of this thing that is so huge, and I think that really influences how I think about it. Yeah, I don't know. Naming is very sacred to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers the question. I just babbled.
No, it does. It's great. Thank you, Dan. Tori.
Yeah, it's interesting. What this made me think of something Eileen said about how different different translations will translate pronouns and names like over time and over in different languages. And it's funny because I get a lot of people asking, I'll get translators being like, well, how do we translate some of the stuff in this book? And they'll be like, how do we do for instance, third person singular pronouns like they, them, and or things like that. Like, because there'll be questions in Spanish and like, lots of words are gendered in Spanish, and how do you do this, or in French or whatever. It's kind of a funny question to me because I don't actually use they, them pronouns in the book. And so there's like an idea of like what trans stuff is. And then there's the question of people will ask me this stuff and I'm like, have you read the book? And part of there's like one or two instances of they, them, because that is pronouns that people use and I respect that. But one of the things I think about is how flexible actually language that already exists is for expressing a lot of these ideas that are already out there, and how names in conjunction with things like pronouns and a sort of like matrix of this stuff ends up indicating things. So here's what I mean by that. For instance, one of the main characters in my book is named Ames in one of the timelines. Ames identifies or is seen to the world as a man, but Ames has detransitioned from a trans woman. And when Ames was a trans woman, Ames was named Amy. And Ames uses he pronouns, Amy uses she pronouns. But then you learn also that before Amy transitioned to a woman, Amy used the name James. So James went back to Ames. Amy didn't go back to James, Amy went to Ames. Like the J was missing from the James. Like you couldn't quite go back all the way to being James. Something was still changed. And then the pronouns that each of these iterations of this person uses are also different. So Ames in the present uses he, Amy uses she, but the person who was James before, I'm remembering through the lens of Amy, and so Amy is thinking of herself in the past as she, so that what the world thinks of Ames as James, the world is probably using he pronouns for James, but James as Amy in the temporality is thinking of she. And so you can use pronouns and names to not just indicate identities, but you can indicate temporalities, the ways that that as you say about, are there fixed identities? Well, actually language and pronouns and names, they indicate not just who you are as like a entity forever, but they indicate who you are through time and the way things change through time. And that language does all of this stuff, even as we already do it. And I sort of laugh when people will be like, well, why didn't you use they, them pronouns for this person who you clearly can't say is a man or a woman over time or whatever? And I'm kind of like, because obviously this person doesn't have a fixed gender. And obviously you can distill that into a political identity and say non-binary, or you can just observe the way that this person lives and be like, this person transcends gender in all sorts of different ways. And it doesn't necessarily always boil down to a particular political identity or particular naming convention or particular pronoun convention, that actually the ways that we live and the ways that these conventions exist in a matrix allow for so many possibilities. If you just let yourself be attuned to what they can do with the language, even that is the most conventional and that already exists and that doesn't change any sort of naming possibilities or conventions or and so on. So that's what this question made me think of.
Tori, I love that. I love that. And part of what your answer made me think of is just, I often find myself in a situation where people who want to be supportive are like, great, we'll change the name on your first book, because your first name, my first book has a different name on it than the name I use now. We'll change it to reflect your current name, and we'll change the pronouns, and it's a memoir. And I actually really feel strongly that the name of the kid who's like in the book should be on the book. It was her experiences. I use she, her pronouns for her. And I want that retained. But one of my weirder, which can be very difficult to explain to people, that I want the name to, on it to remain a name that isn't mine, because I do think of all my life as encompassing all those things and all those different identities. And one of the weirder experiences I've had is working with my agent to make sure that they shaped the contract for the adaptation such that the character with my former name must be played by someone who identifies as female, because I didn't want them telling a trans story in the text, because I was like, you're not adapting my life, you're not adapting the part I didn't choose to tell you in that book, you're adapting this one small part of it, which isn't a story forever, it's just a story of that time, which I think can be difficult for us to, maybe not us to accept, but like I think can be difficult for a broader culture to accept, that these things will shift over time, that they are evolving, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we had more space for that culturally, which is something I think all of our work is going towards making, which maybe leads me to the next question, which Jen, I'd love to start with you for this one. You gave this interview for the Exist Otherwise podcast that I just love so much, in which you quote you back to you. So my apologies for that being awkward, but you said, I don't see art or being an artist as separate from activism or politics. I've never thought about it as infusing it into my work. It's just sort of there. And in some ways it's the purpose of it. And we are, of course, in this time, of sustained political attack on trans lives, and especially on the lives of trans children. And I'm curious how you live in that tension of it being in the work, being the purpose of the work, how you think about your relationship, the relationship between your art and the political landscape.
Wow. Such a big question. The truth is that I can't not think about it. I don't know how, which is sort of what I was getting at, I think, in that initial conversation with that podcast, in that conversation, it's just ingrained in it. It's there. And I think in this moment when there is so much sort of frenzy around transgender identity in a way that feels really amplified from maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Not that these things were not happening then, but there's a way in which it feels heavily amplified right now. Yeah, it's super, super important. And so, like, when I think about this novel, the sort of more specified trans aspect of it is like a very recent change and a very recent addition. And part of what that came from was the fact that in previous drafts, my feeling was I hoped that readers would come away from this book knowing that if they revisited this character in 5 years, this character would be mid-transition. Like, that's how I felt. And after a while, literally maybe a year or two of like thinking through that and wanting that, I thought, well, if that's how I feel, then why not just why not just take the character to that point and make it explicit? If I want that to be like known, like, why not do that? But it does feel like a decision that is also very political, because like I will now be putting this novel out as a trans person who's visibly trans and publicly trans, and we are in this moment, so I don't know, I really sort of embrace that idea in a way that that is a little bit different from how I felt a few years ago, where I was just like, it's just there, and I sort of felt like I didn't have to think about it. I don't feel that way right now. I feel very much that I do have to think about it. And, some of that might also come from being in my role. And like the headline when I got this job was first Black trans woman to lead a major literary publication. And like, there aren't very many of us in publishing as editors even, right? And one of the things that I'm obsessed with and thinking about constantly is how much transness, how much we're being talked about publicly, and how often we are not a part of the conversation. I can't think about the number of times I mean, it's too many to count the number of times when the whole sort of month-long controversy with Dave Chappelle and his stand-up special was happening. I can count on one hand the number of times I saw like TV clips about this, news clips about this, where there's a person who supports trans people and a person who maybe doesn't really support trans rights debating, and nowhere in their conversation is a trans person who can talk about the history of transness and who we are and what this identity is like and why, you know, that conversation is so problematic. It's like, we're not a part of the conversation, right? And so for me, you know, part of my shift is because I'm one person who's willing to be part of the conversation, because, and I want to claim those spaces. Like, I want to like aggressively insert myself in places where people want to talk about me, but have no thought in their mind of including me in the conversation. Like, I'm tired of that. So my writing, my work, how I'm thinking about all of this is really a distillation of that tension. And all of that is like fairly new for me, but that's a clear sort of indication of where I am right now and why I'm sort of doing things the way that I'm doing them.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dan. Eileen and Tori, would either of you like to speak to this?
We're both waiting for the other.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, one of the things I think about with this is you know, how much disagreement there is between trans people, and that there's not a one trans way of doing things. There's not one trans point of view. There's not like kind of one trans take, and that so when I offer things in my writing, I'm not really speaking on behalf of all trans people, and I'm speaking on behalf of ideally, you know, ideally I'd be speaking on behalf of myself, but there aren't enough, so I end up speaking on behalf, or assume to be speaking on behalf of other people. But honestly, the more I can speak for myself, like that's a joy. That's artistic freedom, is the ability to just speak for oneself. And so then there for me is as there's as I'm asked, as I realize how much disagreement there is between trans people on stuff, I try to be able to sort of step back from things that I'm actually not an expert on. Like I wrote a little bit about like trans motherhood, but I don't have a trans kid. You know, I have a stepson who's not trans, so I don't actually know what it's like to raise a trans child. I don't actually know some of these issues, and people will ask me like, well, what do you think about this? And one of the things that I in places like that is I have to take a moment and step back and be like, what is my experience as a trans person? Can I speak to it? And if not, can I like actually be like, no, I'm an artist and a novelist in these ways, but I'm not actually someone who can speak to that issue, and kind of like cede the moment to the person who can speak well to that stuff. Like there are activists who are so incredibly good at talking about this stuff, who are so knowledgeable. I'm not one of them. And so it's nice actually for me to basically to begin to feel like, as a trans person, that my responsibility is in some ways to live and to write what I know and what I feel deeply, but not always to have to speak on behalf of the entire trans experience. And that has allowed me a lot of freedom in my own writing to be problematic, to be a bitch, to be catty, to be all of these things that are not like heroic resilience stories, because I feel that actually that's those same responsibilities to represent everybody aren't for other authors, and in a certain way the political work for me is in claiming the ability to speak for myself and to be non-heroic.
Love that. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know why this is such a hard question. I mean, I guess I just think there's the reality of being inside the work, and there's the reality of being outside the work. You know, there's the author, which is me, and then there's the writer who makes this work that does this other thing. You know, I mean, I guess I've considered myself trans since the 80s, but there was no discourse about it, you know? I mean, I remember interviewing Kate Bornstein and having such an experience that I utterly identified with her, you know, and I was like, oh my God, you know, and it was just like, we were still in the butch femme lesbian binary at that time. And yet I went around exploring and talking to people, and I felt like so many of the so-called butches felt the same way I felt, you know, and which was a very trans feeling. It's just that there was no place to have that conversation, you know, and it still took me, I mean, until we had the era of pronouns to change my pronouns, you know, and that has been such a big deal with publishers fighting to do that, because in my bio, they would really like, well, is that really technically okay? I mean, it was just like literally, you know, but the work itself is pretty fluid, and I have no need to, you know, to kind of fix it in any way. I mean, I have to say, the thing at this moment, I think the thing that fascinates me the most is why is transness such a fucking political issue in our culture? Why, you know, like, why is it, and why are we the hot point of political? I mean, why would they rather? There's so many things wrong and going on in this country today, and why are trans issues the ones that, like, say in Texas, they want to take on and torment kids? Like, why the fuck why would that be it, you know? And so I think it's fascinating, you know. I think it's like the instability of the nation is right there at that spot, you know, and of the kind of like the inability, like it's almost like people feel like if we could fix gender, we wouldn't have to fix bridges or race or in the environment, or, you know, which is pure insanity. You know, I mean, I feel like it's sort of like it's so important because it's so puzzling why it's so important. You know, like, you know, and that I really, I mean, obviously questions violence. You know, we all understand that the experience of being trans in various ways, or people feeling like they've been betrayed by you, they think you're this, and then they see that you're that, and their response, which is so upsetting, is to be violent. But more in the day-to-day, you know, it's just that people want you to stay still for them, so they can stay still, so that we can all agree to be dead and not look at the bigger problems that we're living with right now as we're destroying our planet, you know, which is that a trans issue? Maybe it is, you know?
Yeah, that makes me think about like the question of distraction. And there's like a Toni Morrison quote that I really like, which is that the very serious work of racism is distraction, and that there's something very similar happening with trans issues right now, that like basically the way you can stop things is by creating these distractions, to be like, who goes to what bathroom, who can you get a, you know, there's what, one trans athlete in the state of Utah, but let's have the entire Utah legislature get together so that this, like, literally one girl cannot swim in a pool somewhere. Let's bring the weight of an entire state upon that person. Like, that's a distraction, and that's a distraction from other things that aren't working, and it's a distraction to stop, so that those of us who want to live, who want progress, have to spend our time fighting on behalf of one swimmer, and it stops progress. So for me, like, some of the work, I think in my writing, and when I say I want to be non-heroic, part of it is related to the question of distraction, which is that I refuse to let myself be the distraction that they will make me into.
Mm-hmm.
I refuse I will let the activists who speak really well on these issues, I will let them talk, but I am not going to like be deviated from the things that matter in my life, to have fights about premises and terms and battles that I didn't choose, that I don't think are productive, and that feed into siphoning the energy that's like a productive, amazing energy of this moment into something where it could be squandered. And so for me, that is the big thing, realizing the degree to which distraction itself is a transphobic move, and not countenancing it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great.
That was fantastic. All of you. Den, were you about to add to that?
Oh, I was just going to say 100%. I think about that specific Toni Morrison quote almost on a daily basis in regards to basically my entire being and like trying to get my work done. Like it's all these things are distraction. And I think I will say, I guess really quickly, that does also, I think that sort of answers Eileen's question too earlier, in that also very often it's a political distraction. And that's not to say that there aren't real serious nut jobs in our government who really do hate trans people like aggressively. But like when you think about why they are there and what the sort of conservative establishment really wants to accomplish, like we are politicized as such because we can be a distraction from, you know, other issues that really affect the foundation of this country and its political sort of viability. And so I keep that in mind as well. But it's like, we might be a political distraction, but also there are very real consequences, you know, should these attacks on transness go unaddressed. So it's like, we're used as a scapegoat, but we have to resist in some ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I love that. And thank you all for this just gorgeous and impactful conversation. I think you've left me with a lot to think about. And I think that we're leaving the audience with a great deal to think about. We're about to end. And so I would just love to end. I'm going to give you two options for like an ending remarks thing. Because I was very curious, you know, if you could talk to your childhood self, this like little grumpy trans kid about writing, what would you say? Or if you don't want to speak to that, what would you leave the audience with after this conversation? What would you like them to take away? You could see us out.
I guess I would say to my childhood self about writing, I'd be like, oh, you should consider it, because I definitely didn't. But you know, as to the audience, I would say, you know, I would just implore people to read and enjoy, and not just read, and not just think of educating yourself by reading trans books, but I would implore people to enjoy trans books, because a lot of us are writing not from a place of like arguing, but from a place of like, here's the joy of putting certain experiences into words, and experiences that maybe not just we had, but that we have a angle on experiences that other people have probably also had, and that actually reading trans work isn't homework. It's not education. It's not something that you do necessarily to be a good citizen. It actually it can be a pleasure in art the same way that so many other types of art are. So that's my message to the audience.
I think it would be that it's okay not to know. That not knowing is a vast, beautiful space early in your life, later in your life, not knowing who you are, not knowing who other people are, not knowing what's going to happen, and being willing to explore the space of your existence. You know, I just feel like it's like there's a trans-dimensionality that we're living in all the time. It's like who you are, when you are, where you are. It's very mysterious, you know, and I think we're all becoming all the time. And it was so scary to be young and not know, you know, and I just figured I was always trying to figure out from TV or people around me how to quickly get it together like they seem to have done, you know, and it just, in effect, you know, the morphing was the beautiful thing. The morphing was where and when and how when I figured out that somebody else didn't know, or they were kind of fiddling too, I would meet them and we would start to have an exchange, you know. So I just feel like to have time to be, I don't know, you know, in the transition of existence, you know, just early on and always.
I think for me, I would probably tell my childhood self to relax a little bit and take some risks and then write about them. You know, don't be so scared. And in terms of the audience, I would also just say, you know, keep reading trans authors. Don't deny yourself the pleasure of reading trans work. There really is a way in which the work of trans writers it's part of a literary tradition of work that like really reimagines like things that we take as foundational, and that's a part of transness. And so when you get to read our work, you get to read work that does that. And I think there's so much work out there that doesn't do that. And I think that's, you know, gets at the very heart of the excitement of reading. So.
I love that. And frankly, I think I would tell Kid B that this conversation is coming and that they just need to hold out long enough for it. And how many narratives there are out there to be discovered, to be lived, to be made that they can't yet imagine, but that are coming. So for all of you on this panel, thank you so much for sharing your words and your wisdom and your beauty with us today. For all of this, you in the audience, thank you so much for attending the San Antonio Book Festival, whether you've been joining us in person or virtually. We hope you enjoy many of the offerings at the festival's 10th anniversary. Thank you so much and have a good afternoon.
Yay.
Thank you.
Great meeting you guys.